He's written for The Telegraph, The Financial Times, The Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, The Spectator, City AM, Conservative Home, International Business Times, and CapEx, and has appeared on Sky News, Newsnight, BBC News, Bloomberg TV, CNBC, Scotland Tonight, and The Today Programme, as well as many others. Can't be many others. I think that's the entire media. He likes cooking and pop music and reviews restaurants at Straight Up London. He'll be talking today about neoliberalism. Please give him a clap as he comes to the stage.
Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm going to try and squeeze in quite a lot into a short space of time. I was once told to never speak in public for longer than you can last in bed. So in conclusion, I bristle at the term left libertarian. I am not a left libertarian. Although some of them are my best friends, I don't like left libertarianism. I don't believe in left libertarianism. And I believe that this conference or this event has been falsely labeled. And you're all victims of fraud, because I'm not going to be talking about that at all. I'm going to be talking about neoliberalism, which is partially a troll of people and partially by embracing a word that does not have a good reputation, but is also, I think, a valuable way of understanding a particular group of people. If you could ignore, by the way, the giant P on the thing, that's a typo. I didn't intend to include that, but what I'm going to do really is just give you a vague outline of this kind of philosophy that I think is similar in many ways to kind of mainstream libertarianism, but also differs in some ways as well. Before I do that, though, I want to bring your attention to something called the Long Depression, which was a period towards the end of the 19th century, the final 3 decades, during which the global economy changed dramatically. It's kind of mislabeled. It wasn't really a depression. Economic growth was slower then in most countries than it had been, but it was still positive. Unemployment wasn't especially high, except in certain areas, but it was a period of massive dislocation. It was a period of massive change, and one that I think actually shaped 20th century history in a very, very harmful way. The important point from the quote I've got up on the screen is the final line. The Depression affected some quite distinct social groups who became loud in complaint at the economic liberalism that had caused such troubles. So I want to give you a brief overview of this period. This was basically where the Industrial Revolution really started to change people's lives across the world. It began with the financial panic of 1873. Real interest rates began to fall and fell to historically very, very low levels. Previous people who had been able to exist solely on their savings by buying government bonds and living off the income from that were no longer able to do that. During this period, Europe's agrarian base was eroded, raw materials, food prices fell across the world relative to manufacturing prices, and there was massive migration into towns. The cause of this was mostly technological. There were huge technological advances during this period. Railways extended their way into countries like Russia, the US, Argentina. Shipping, because of steam shipping advances, shipping became much cheaper. You could have much smaller crews. You could do global shipping on much, much less coal. And because of this, the global grain market and the global food market opened up and became, for the first time, a global market. Imports from Russia, from the US, from Australia, from Argentina into Europe caused the price of food to fall dramatically. And that had the effect of putting many European farmers out of business, and it drove European farmers into the cities. They could no longer kind of live in the sort of agrarian life that they had previously had. Their parents, their grandparents had lived on. Things changed dramatically. I've got some interesting statistics on the board there, but this was true not just of grain, but of food, refrigeration technology, dairy, coffee, any kind of raw material you really care to think of during this period fell dramatically in price. So the consequences of this were the great migrations into the cities, the huge urbanization, the likes of which the Western world really had never seen before. This led to independent artisans being priced out. Raw materials meant that factories could develop big economies of scale. Labor was extremely cheap because there was so much movement into cities. And this had the effect of creating, for the first time, a kind of an urban working class, an urban proletariat. After the tremendous downward pressure on prices, the tremendous cheapening of the price of food, there were calls for tariffs, and these calls were successful. The calls for tariffs meant that after this huge dislocation had taken place, after all these people had moved into the cities, the price of food began to rise. People's purchasing power began to fall, and so we had, for the first time again, this clamor for kind of socialism. Clamor for tariffs led to increase in the cost of living, which led to the growth of the trade union and labor movement. On the right, imperialism, nationalism, tariffs all became increasingly popular. And some of the kind of artisans, some of the manufacturers also used this as an opportunity to get tariffs as well. And the consequence, according to Norman Stone and some other historians, and I think it's probably accurate, was ultimately the death of classical liberalism. Caught between nationalism on the right and left-wing socialism on the left, classical liberalism really had nothing to offer. So what I want to ask is, during this era of massive technological progress, globalization, in the wake of a financial panic which caused huge economic dislocations and demand for protectionism and demand for nationalism, during which growth increased but people's economic security fell, does this remind you of anything? Does it ring any bells? I think the parallels with today are striking, and it's very, very useful, I think, to have this in mind when we think about the future, because we could be facing a repeat of the mistakes that were made in response to the Long Depression. We could be walking back and repeating the same errors that led to the worst, in terms of war and in terms of death, the worst century in global history, the 20th century. So with that in mind, I want to talk about neoliberalism. I'm not going to try and persuade you to be a neoliberal. I'm not going to try and tell you that it's better than whatever you believe, but I want to persuade you that it exists and that it's a useful term for a particular group of people who may be to some extent your allies and maybe to some extent not your allies. I'm going to briefly just talk about the principles, that kind of model of the world, the priorities that we have, what things matter to us most, and where the main issue on which we would disagree with libertarians about things. So I consider Milton Friedman, and he did actually use the term sometimes. He has a very interesting essay from the 1960s on the term neoliberalism. I consider Milton Friedman to be the classic neoliberal. Consequentialist, globalist, interested in the global poor, interested in the welfare of people at the bottom wherever they are, and most of all, interested in the poorest people in the world. Fans of migration, fans of property rights, fans of markets and trade, but fans of these things because they work. Fans of these things because they increase people's living standards, they give people more control over their own lives, and they allow more people to live the lives they want to live. Not because they guarantee rights, not because they have some kind of moral brilliance to them, just because they work. Neoliberals are very suspicious of politics. They're very, very suspicious of populism, very suspicious of any kind of appeal to the crowd, any kind of appeal to the masses overthrowing elites. This is something that makes us very nervous. And we're comfortable with political pragmatism and redistribution. And I think to summarize the view of a neoliberal, government's role is to facilitate as much wealth creation as possible and redistribute some of it. So with this in mind, the biggest priority for neoliberals right now, and with the events of the Long Depression in mind, the biggest priority is to defend the global neoliberal order, defend the trading order, defend the free flow of movement of people, of capital around the world. And the reason that this matters so much is that it seems as if the dislocations that this causes are having very, very unpleasant political effects. This is a graph of unemployment as it relates to vote for Marine Le Pen in the very recent French elections. It's obviously quite a clear correlation. This shows us the impact that trade, more trade with China, the so-called China shock, has on employment in the US. I think this is county-level data, showing that basically the more imports from China that go into a particular county, the more unemployment takes place in that county. This is something that we need to be aware of. This dislocation is something that took place in the 19th century, and it's something that leads to increased reliance on benefits. Interestingly, more so on things like medical benefits than on TAA, which is the actual US benefit designed to mitigate the trade impact, the kind of shocks that trade causes. More that seems to happen is people leaving the labor force altogether and counting themselves as being disabled. And we have the kind of classic, which I presume everybody's aware of, connection between the rise in Latino share of population and support for Trump. Note that it's not the level of Latino share of population, it's the rise, it's the change that seems to be a better predictor. But as liberals, as libertarians, as neoliberals, we know that the disruption is worth it. Trade is extremely good, and it's particularly good for the poor. Not just for the global poor. We know about China. We know how important property rights and trade have been for China, but also in the developed world. In the US, if we ended trade, it's the bottom 10% that would become the poorest. They would become the worst off because goods would become more expensive. And we know that, in fact, actually automation is also one of the really leading causes of this dislocation. It may not even be trade at all. So these disruptions are worth it, but they do have political costs. Paul Krugman actually has a very, very good line about this. Trying to stop trade to sort of undo the dislocations that happen is like a motorist who drives over a pedestrian and then to undo the damage reverses over him again to kind of stop things. Stopping trade will not help the poor, but we have to be aware of the impact that trade does have on them. We also think we need to maximize wealth creation by doing things like planning reform, making it easier to build, tax reform. Those are Jaffa cakes. Probably Kiwi or New Zealanders and Australians know what those are, but a lot of Americans don't. It's a very interesting court case about defining whether a Jaffa cake is a cake and hence VAT exempt or a biscuit and hence VAT liable, which was ended when the McVitie's brought in a giant Jaffa cake to show the jury this is indeed a cake. So it's very interesting stuff. But then the heresy that neoliberals believe in, and I think quite strongly believe in, is that redistribution is good. It's not just tolerable, it's not just a political thing that we need to accept, it is a good thing that we should support. Now, Will Wilkinson makes a weak version of this argument in his interesting point about Wagner's law, which is that government spending basically never seems to fall. This is government spending as a share of GDP in the UK. Since the war, it's sort of hovered around. It does move around. Obviously, we have the sort of Thatcher years where it declined a bit, but it's really only moving within the kind of 30% to 50% bound. We're never really getting back to this point here. But I don't think that's a very interesting argument, because saying that, it's not going to happen, that's not a very persuasive argument to libertarians. We know it's never going to happen. We know that everything we believe in is a very difficult thing to get. So I think 4 arguments for redistribution are that markets are very good at allocating wealth efficiently according to the most productive people, but nature is very cruel in who it makes productive and who it doesn't make productive. If you're a Hayekian like me, then you agree with Mike Munger's point that markets are very good because they allow people to show how much they want things. They allow people to express the intensity of their desire for a resource. But when people have very, very different amount of resources available to them, there is an inefficiency in the market there. Resources are not actually being allocated as efficiently as they could be. Pragmatically, I think people are less likely to oppose things like trade, wealth-enhancing reforms, if they think that their own personal economic situation is more secure. And rhetorically, having support for simple forms of redistribution, like a basic income or a negative income tax, allows us to oppose more effectively off-balance sheet redistribution, like minimum wage. Minimum wage is just a tool of redistribution. It's just a very, very crude one that tends to take from poor people and give to less poor people and create a lot of unemployment in the process. So to conclude, the kind of point, I've tried to give you a very brief overview, and you can read my article, I'm a Neoliberal, maybe you are too, if you'd like a slightly more detailed view. But to conclude, I think what should matter to people like us is the welfare of people at the bottom, both in our countries and globally. And I think right now the biggest priority is making sure that those people do not disrupt the wealth-creating and wealth-enhancing policies that we know work in the long term, just because of the dislocations that they cause in the short term. And the big challenge for people who believe in markets is to reconcile the short-term disruption with the long-term gains from trade and migration. And that, I think, is the greatest pressure facing us. And once we recognize that, then it will allow us to oppose people like Marine Le Pen and the sort of rising right-wing and left-wing populism in many countries in Europe more effectively. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, it wasn't redistribution. I didn't think I'd hear that at a libertarian conference. So we've already got a very spicy topic to discuss. Now, just to remind you all, use the Hoover app, put in some questions. If you don't, I'll have to ask questions. And all of you are much more attractive and intelligent than I am, so you get more quality if you ask the questions instead of me. So, Hoover comments, or I guess if you're on Twitter, you don't have Hoover, maybe you can post them using ALSFC as the hashtag. I'll probably find them there. Our second speaker is Avens O'Brien. She's a second-generation libertarian activist, the product of unschooling, peaceful parenting, and started university at 14 years old. Her work within the libertarian movement includes being vice chair of the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, but from 2006 to 2008. working for Peter Schiff's investment firm, and multiple presidential campaigns, including Ron Paul's 2008 campaign. She contributes to the Libertarian Republic, where her most viral article was 12 Reasons You Can't Get a Liberty Lady. She is a chapter leader of the Ladies of Liberty Alliance and is probably best known as a Facebook agitator who never blocks anybody, which is, that's really something to go on the resume, I think. And I'll have to apologise for my language up front. Her speech title is I'm Not a Fucking Leftist, but Here's Why Idiots Call Me One. Welcome, O'Brien. To the stage.
So anyway, I wanted to talk about the Nolan chart first because there's a whole lot of conversation about left libertarianism, right libertarianism, what they mean exactly, and why they're used sometimes as insults among libertarians. But David Nolan in 1969 developed this Nolan chart to try to change the understanding of the political compass as not a one-dimensional left-right spectrum, but rather this two-dimensional aspect where there's personal issues and there's economic issues, and at the top is libertarianism. And so if you believe in full freedom for personal issues, full freedom for economic issues, you're not a liberal or a conservative, you're just a libertarian. And so for the record, whenever I take this quiz, I end up at the very top of it. However, because I sometimes talk about things that leftists or liberals or Democrats or other people care about, people call me a leftist. They call me a leftist because I advocate just as strongly, besides economic issues, for things like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, for sex workers' rights, for feminism, for gay rights, and for all sorts of things that people go, oh, do we really want to talk about that? That might make us unpopular. And I'm willing to talk about those things. I care about those things. And so they're very degenerate things, but I think they make life more fun. So what I was going to say, my notes are really terribly written. So on that, I could talk about, there's a lot of subjects that I talk about. If you've ever seen, I don't know if any of you follow me on Facebook. If you've ever seen me on Facebook, I love to agitate and talk about a lot of different topics and get people on the left and the right to get very angry and argue. And so when I talk about leftist issues, I could talk about LGBT issues, but I think Andie's got that in the next presentation, so I'm going to let Andie do that. I could talk about my support of immigration rights, my right to be able to rent to sell to, and to employ anyone regardless of their documentation coming into my own country. I could talk about drug rights and the fact that I believe that anyone has the right to put anything they want into their body or take anything out of it, whether that's marijuana, heroin, or a fetus. So what I'm going to talk about instead, because I have the angry feminist hair color and haircut, is I'm going to talk about feminism. And so I'm going to start with the fact that in I'm going to mention the fact that David Nolan, the inventor of this chart, went on to co-found the Libertarian Party in the US in 1971. And in 1972, we had two presidential candidates, John Hospers, who was openly gay, and Toni Nathan, who's a woman. And she's actually the only woman in the US before Hillary Clinton to have won an electoral vote in the 1972 election. Toni Nathan, after her run as vice president, went on to found the Association of Libertarian Feminists. And the reason she did this was because feminism was becoming a big issue in the US and in other parts of the world. But there were a lot of things that were important to her that feminists were bringing up about their own rights, about women's rights not being recognized in the US. And she wanted to make sure that there was a place for people who cared about those issues to go when they didn't want government to solve them, when they didn't want government to redistribute stuff, she didn't want government to be the arbiter of how these rights should come about. Simply, the government should get the hell out of the way. So the reason that this was really important to me is because my mother was involved in this fight. My mother is 40 years older than me. She started college in 1964, and she's also a libertarian activist. And in 1964, she didn't have legal access to birth control. She didn't have legal access to an abortion. And when she got a job in 1964 and wanted to put her money in a bank account, she wasn't allowed to unless her father or her husband co-signed on that bank account. It wasn't her money, it was theirs. And she could only access it with their permission. And so she found a bank that would allow her to do that. But the fact is, she had a big fight ahead of her. And so I grew up in an era where those problems didn't exist. My mother had to fight for those rights, but I didn't. But as a result of her, I've always been a member of the Association of Libertarian Feminists, and I've always cared about feminist issues, about seeing the fact that women at some time in history did not have the same legal rights, and they still in many places still don't. And in the US, less so, but there are still reasons to care about feminism. In fact, yeah, actually, I was realizing in 1973 in the U.S. is when when Roe v. Wade was passed. And prior to that, there were only 4 states in which someone could get an abortion. Like the rest of the states in the U.S., should be 46 of them, you could not access an abortion. So, obviously, the question I get most often in terms of why I care about feminism is, what the hell is left? Like, we've got a right to birth control, we've got a right to abortion. So what's the matter with feminism? Feminism might need to happen in Saudi Arabia or those other countries where they don't have women's rights, but what about in the U.S.? And it's a fair question to ask, because I think that when you look at third wave feminism, you certainly, they're a little crazy. Even the libertarian feminists are going to tell you that they're batshit. But feminism does actually have relevance today in the US and other Western countries. See, in the US, we still have to deal with abortion rights being threatened. Things like HB 2 in Texas last year, which was struck down by the Supreme Court, created extra regulations for abortion clinics that were completely unnecessary and created undue burden for women to access abortions. Birth control should be available over the counter, and it isn't presently. It's something that feminists have not done enough to actually fight for, and libertarian feminists are much more adamant about this subject, the fact that we should be able to access birth control without having to go to a doctor and say, hey, can you please give me my prescription? I don't know what the status of birth control pills here in Australia is, but in the US, you actually have to go to a doctor. There's 4 states in the US that allow you to get birth control without a prescription, and they're California, Oregon, and I can't remember the other 2, so never mind that list. But there are other laws that women are subject to in the states, particularly regarding pregnancy. Because as soon as you become pregnant in the US, you lose your right to things like actual care if you happen to be a drug user. If you happen to be a drug user and you can go to a clinic and get rehabilitation help, then that's great. But if you happen to have a fetus inside of you, suddenly you are imprisonable. And so that's a huge issue for me, the idea that we need to get people help, not put women in prison and then put their babies in the care of the state. In 2013, a woman in Florida wanted to have a natural birth, and the state of Florida her doctor first advised that she should have a C-section regardless of whether or not she wanted one. And then the state of Florida actually held that ruling, that she would have to have a C-section whether or not she consented. And this is the sort of thing that still exists in the United States, that she doesn't have the right to her own body to determine how she's going to actually have her baby. This isn't even about abortion. This is about her right to control how she has her baby. On top of that, there are certain issues that libertarian feminists are willing to talk about that mainstream feminists in the US don't. Something like rape culture in prison, which is something that I care deeply about. And I think you were going to talk a little bit about that, Andie, so that's good, because I don't have enough time to keep going on about that. But one of the issues that I tend to care about is dealing with not just rape culture in terms of people harassing women on the streets or things like that, but the fact that in prison, people are stuck in cages and susceptible to things like rape. And I do believe that feminism has a role to play in the social conversation. And I'm not talking about social justice warriors yelling about things that don't really matter, about like, oh well, like let's degender all toys or whatever. That's not the thing that I care about. But the fact is, my 5-year-old niece was told the other day that girls aren't allowed to like Star Wars from some other boy who's like 5 years old. And I think that feminism has an ability to just be a critical lens on looking at why do we make these assumptions, and how can we just combat them without making it a huge cause, but making it something that we just constantly look at with a critical eye and argue in public spaces about the proper role of gender. Lastly, since I have about 2 minutes left, is I want to leave you with this point, is that a lot of people, especially in the US, I have no idea what it's like here in Australia, so I'm sorry I can't speak intelligently about that. But in the US, in libertarian circles, there's a lot of people who refer to people who care about issues that Democrats might care about sex work, about feminism, about gay rights, that they refer to us as leftists simply because we want to talk about these things. And that doesn't make us leftists. At the end of the day, I'm a Murray Rothbard hardcore capitalist. And so, I worked for Peter Schiff. I'm an Austrian economist. I'm not a leftist by any stance unless you're on the right side of the spectrum and my middle happens to be your left. So that's what I want to leave you with. Not every person you call a leftist is actually a leftist. It's about, do they care about economic freedom and do they care about personal freedom? There you go.
All right. So our third speaker is Andie Moore. Andie was born and raised in Wellington, New Zealand, drawn to libertarianism, reading about the 1980s liberal reforms of former Finance Minister Roger Douglas, and also encountering the perils of bureaucracy during their teen years. Having ranted endlessly about the shortcomings of government, they channeled their libertarian angst into starting New Zealand's first Students for Liberty Club. Andie currently lives in Melbourne and is about to commence their second year of a Bachelor of Arts in Politics and International Studies and Social Theory at the University of Melbourne. Andie identifies as a left libertarian and is thoroughly interested in anarchism, feminism, queer theory, agorism, and free markets, with the aim of a freer society based on reciprocity, free exchange, and self-determination. They're also the vice chairperson of Australia and New Zealand Students for Liberty. I'd also say you've never seen anybody tear down a Marxism conference posted much like Andie. I've seen it personally. It's fearsome and wonderful. They'll be speaking on queering libertarianism. Please welcome them to the stage.
Just trying to get it up. Is that the one there? Oh yeah, it came to it. Cool. The clicker works and everything?
Apparently so.
Cool. There we go. Hi everyone. Yeah, nice RuPaul there. Hi, I'm Andie. Thank you so much. Tim would be here, but I'd like to thank Tim for when he sees the video for inviting me here. It's my first time at Friedman speaking at the actual conference, so it's a massive honour and it's great to be aside to such experienced speakers. I am the fucking leftist on the panel. I'd say I'm a leftist myself, just kind of like for tactical reasons. I like to say I'm a leftist because it lures people in who would not consider libertarianism otherwise. Today I'm going to talk about queering libertarianism. And it's probably going to be like, I reckon probably one of the most SJW talks you will ever hear at Friedman. I'm going to talk about identity, about how government policies, regulations shape, mould queer identity, and how it changes what it means to be queer in like the current state of society. So kind of the first question would be, what is queering? So queering is kind of like a term which is chucked around in kind of literary theory, social theory circles. The term queer, first off, it's often used kind of to refer to LGBTQ people, but it can be more than that. So the whole idea about being queer is being non-normative. It's about taking what is seen as normal in society, what is kind of enforced in society, and subverting it. So challenging stereotypes. And it's usually done traditionally by gender, sexuality, and sex. So examples of having a queer gender, you can have a queer gender, you could have a queer sexuality, in terms of you could be into kinks, you could be transgender, you could be genderqueer, you could be intersex, you could be homosexual, bisexual. Those broadly fall under the idea of being queer, because you are subverting current norms of sexuality, gender, and sex. So yeah, the focus is on inversion and challenging the idea of normality. However, the kind of idea of being queer and subverting what is meant to be normal also kind of entails its own politics. It's about kind of challenging structures which enforce concepts of normality and like kind of pressure people into certain ways of being and certain ways of acting in society, which I'll kind of explain about today. Then there's libertarianism. Libertarianism is belief in individual liberty. I mean, we'll know that we'll roughly be libertarians, libertarian sympathetic. It's the idea that we should not be forced. Force should not be our first resort of action. We should be left to trade. We should be left to interact as free individuals, and we should live together peacefully and cohesively. Sorry, I'm trying to ram this in. I thought this was going to be long. I had more time than this. The idea I'm trying to create out of this is to mix queering and libertarianism. Try to queer libertarianism. So if we use queering as a lens, we treat libertarianism as the ideology, we can turn this into a larger analysis. So to have a queering view on society is to see how institutions have played a part in the suppression or enforcement of identities in people. So if we're having queering libertarianism, we look at what the government does. We look at how the government has kind of pressured people into adopting straight identities or cisgender identities. By the way, cisgender means if you have the sex, what your sex assigned at birth lines up with your gender. So just clarification. And we want to look how the government regulates, marginalises and erases queer people. And I'll go through some examples of that today. My main aim today is to go over ways governments today impact queer people's lives in ways we don't consider. Because we talk about queer issues, we always hear the classic ones of gay marriage, we had anti-discrimination law, but there are lots of subtle ways that regulations impact on our lives, or our abilities to adopt subcultures. Or often there are policies which affect queer people we never consider or never hear about. So that's kind of what I want to go over today. So yeah, there's no question the state oppressed and controlled queers in the past, but what about today? So we've kind of heard about many of the examples of the past where we had gay conversion therapy, we had chaplains in schools, we had colonialist practices where indigenous sexualities were, their expressions or indigenous genders, like third genders, were banned from expressions in schools and churches. But yeah, the question is, what about today? So I'm going to kind of break it up into regulation, marginalisation and erasure. So the first question is regulation. So marriage. Marriage is obviously regulated. And the idea of marriage in our current society is marriage is a pinnacle of life. So it's one of the stages of life, a rite of passage. So marriage in our current society is considered incredibly important. It's considered a pinnacle. But the government monopolisation of marriage means it gets to control it. So the idea, first off, and I'm kind of going to work through this quite discursively, is that the government gets to control a pinnacle of society, it gets to control marriage. And by regulating it and by excluding it, it manages to take a pinnacle of society and strain it towards one area of the population. What it manages to do is to say, marriage is a pinnacle of society, but we get to exclude queer people from it. So what it does is it takes what is an important, meaningful part of society and it puts exclusion at the very heart of it. So by excluding queer people from an institution by force and by regulation, what it does is it starts to create meaningful spaces for queer people to be excluded from life or to be delegitimised. It stops queer definition of marriage, so it stops us from redefining institutions for ourselves or finding our own meaningful way to go about our lives. And it stops us from doing what they want. Well, that text about down the bottom should not be there. That was just draft texting. But yeah, the main idea is that we have to go to the government to get permission to be married. We have to, get their blessing. And this is a real issue. We don't want to go to the government for permission to live our lives or to act as we want. And the issue is, as well, is when we get into the debate about marriage, the question ends up being, should we be equal? Or should we be equal in the marriage licensing institution, or should marriage be traditional? When the real question is, why should the government be there? A lot of queer people don't want the government intervening in their lives, and they don't want governments telling them how they can and cannot define their relationships. And it gets even more problematic. I hate to bring that up as an example because he was a speaker here, but there was a big controversy about a debate which was hosted by, I forgot it was hosted by, Cooper's? It was Cooper's, yeah. Cooper's held a debate on marriage equality. And I think it was a bit of a mad fuss. It shouldn't have been a massive fuss. But there was one thing which stuck out about it. So the two people I picked were both Liberal MPs. It was Tim Wilson, I forgot the other guy. He was more conservative. Hasty, yeah. And Tim Wilson's argument that he made, oh my God, I'm gonna go fast. So I'm gonna go fast. I'll go through that quickly. So Tim Wilson's argument in the end for gay marriage was that family is an important part of society and queer people should be included in it. The idea is that queer people shouldn't be living their lives as they want or redefine marriage. They should adopt the definition of marriage already held by society. So the idea is we should assimilate queer people into this already family-centric society rather than allow them to live their lives as they please or take on their own definitions. Cool, I'm gonna go quick now. So licensing gender. I'm a genderqueer person myself. I don't identify as a guy or a girl. However, I have a M marked on my birth certificate, and I have an M on my passport. I don't have $600 up my sleeve. I'm from New Zealand. Yeah, it makes it even better. So if I want to go change my name, I've got to spend $600 on getting my birth certificate changed, my passport changed, and if I'm under 18, I have to get parental permission. And not everyone gets parental permission. Not everyone can go and get their documentation changed. It often involves going through court. So the government basically tells you how you can legally how you can refer to yourself in legal institutions. When you go to the bank, the government tells you what you can call yourself. You can't say, I prefer to be called Andie. They tell you, no, you have to use this name which we've ascribed to you at birth. And they say, tough luck. If you want to do otherwise, we're going to charge you. So it puts a price on you actually expressing your identity as you wish. Hormones. It was interesting, Avens, you brought up contraception before. Hormones gets even worse. So in Australia, to get onto hormones, I was looking it up before. So I haven't gone onto hormones and I haven't managed to go through the process. But to get hormones as a trans person, to start transitioning, you have to get a GP appointment, you have to get a psychologist session, and at least 2 psychiatrist sessions to get hormones. If you're under 18, you cannot get hormones. But there is one option. You can go through family court. You can make an application to family court, so you go through a legal process, and provided you've got all of the recommendations, you can get an application through to them. Here's the catch. In Victoria, 14 out of 200 applications for hormones for under 18s, pick about 16, were accepted. So even though they went through all the bureaucracy, they still got rejected. And there are stories of queer people submitting and resubmitting their applications for hormones and getting rejected. And having to go through that painful process every time to have the government tell you, you can't do that. And it's really shit, it really is. There's also normalising surgeries, and I won't have so much time to go into it, so I'll skip over it a bit quickly. But the idea is that when intersex people are born, so people with non-discriminate genitalia, non-discriminate male or female, there is surgery which can be used on them, and the idea of consent's a bit dodgy because it's a child. But what the surgery does is it modifies the genitals, and it's often something which becomes traumatic for children later on. And it's often described as a process of genital mutilation by intersex groups because it creates trauma, depression, pains later on in their lives, and basically a whole lot of really terrible shit. Self-defense, I'll go this really quickly. Queer people can't defend themselves. In Australia, we have incredibly tough rules on guns. The idea is you cannot hold a weapon or a dangerous object unless you have a legitimate reason, and that legitimate reason can only be self-defense. Cannot be self-defense. And this is the key idea. Self-defense is not legitimate. Queer people are more likely to be attacked violently than straight people. So self-defense is illegitimate. Why is self-defense illegitimate? Because you're the police to protect you. Queer people are more likely to be attacked. So you tell queer people that you don't have to defend yourself so the government can do it for you. Queer people are also more likely to distrust the police because there's been a lot of surveys showing that it's often shown that the police are dominated by working class people who are not so, who are more hostile to alternative sexualities. So queer people don't feel more comfortable with them, but are paternalised and told they've got to suck it up. They can't use anything to defend themselves. So marginalisation, prisons, strip searches. If you're a prisoner, you get patted down. You get patted down quite a lot, and you get touched. You get felt up, and you basically get searched all the time for drugs or whatever you're possessing. And for trans people, this is very invasive, especially if you have gender dysphoria and you're very uncomfortable with parts of your body. Gender sorting. People are sorted based on their sex at birth. If you're a trans woman and you identify as a woman, but you were assigned male at birth, you get put in a male prison. Let me put it this way. So we've got 5 people here. Imagine we're all trans. 2 of us will be raped. So 40% of trans people are raped in prison. 40%. So you basically have to expect there's a likelihood you'll be raped if you're trans. And if you consider prisons, a lot of the representation of prisons are victimless crimes, and that's also an effect of the drug war, and I'll talk about that soon. So the prison rape rates are high, and if the corrections decide to protect queer people for their own safety, trans people, they put them in solitary, they put them alone. Is that time? Time. Okay. Yeah, I'll skip through it quickly. Refugees is another example. There are high amounts of refugee rape within prison, within detention centres, from other refugees who have conservative views, or from other people on the islands. Otherwise, if they don't arrive on boat and they get sent back home, or they don't leave on boat, they get put in Indonesia where there's lots of homophobia. Erasure, the drug war. So there's chemsex, which is a practice often used by queer people, by some queer people, where people take crystal methamphetamine, GHB or methadone, and combine it with hardcore sex, so an alternative sexuality and alternative drug. Because drugs are illegal, because drugs are stigmatized as a result, people cannot access help with harm reduction or with physical or mental health problems related to their drug use. What's more, because it is stigmatized to have, frankly, hardcore gay sex, there's double stigmatization and you cannot talk about your problems. With the club scene, the drug war has been used to justify raids on nightclubs. And basically has shut down a lot of queer space in the past. And it's because a lot of queer people like to take drugs. It's part of the process of experimentation and sexuality. It's just a fact of how our community is, and that's how we live. We should respect that. And yeah, it puts limits on experience. You ban people from taking drugs and being psychedelic. You stop people from experiencing themselves in a radical way. And that's what being queer is often about being yourself and experiencing your individuality. Schooling. Gender sorting is all the way throughout schooling. Yeah, we normalise the nuclear family, and we don't actually talk about queer people existing. Last thing in nanny statism, alcohol and tobacco taxes, they make hedonism expensive. If you want to be sinful, if you want to be degenerate, and you want to put things in your body, which the government does not like, they charge you more. And you have lockout laws. So what's my point? Ask the Dordelano. My point, the government institutionally paternalise and can't keep up with queer people. Queer people are too radically individualist in many ways, and too challenging for the government to keep up with them. And the issue is when the government has risky actions being taken within the society, they can't deal with them, they have to regulate them out of existence. And that means that puts queer people at a disadvantage. The collectivist bureaucratic nature of government prevents us from catering to individual queer needs. We know what we want, and the government often does not know what we want. And they can't cater for us. The way that governments determine legitimacy, in terms of self-defense, for example, constitutes society's views on queer people. So discourse produces reality. The nature of queer lifestyles are at odds with the ideas of government, and the government makes living queer more costly and more dangerous. And the government accepts rape within our institutions and says it's inevitable. My time is up. I'm off. Peace.
I just want to begin by saying, Andie, we won't discriminate against you because you're from New Zealand. It's okay. Now, we have lots of questions. There's still time to get more questions in. We've got 15 minutes, so hopefully we can get some really good ones. So if you've got a good question, still chuck it in there. We'll probably try and go for a question for at least each of you. You got the microphone, that's great. So we'll go to Sam first. So Nick asks, what are the more honest forms of redistribution behind which neoliberals can support?
Well, I think cash transfers should replace as much redistribution as possible. And I don't just mean welfare, I mean health spending, I mean education spending. The more government tries to spend money for people, the more money is wasted. One of the other questions which I kind of want to roll into this is there any evidence that redistribution works? And there is loads of evidence actually from the randomized control trials that Give Directly does in Africa. And I often refer to this as sort of applied libertarianism because Give Directly is a charity that literally gives people directly money. It doesn't spend it on mosquito nets, it doesn't do anything, it just gives people in very poor parts of Africa and India money. And not only do they do that, they follow up years later and they do proper, rigorous studies of the impact that this money has. And they find enormous health improvements in the for children especially. 5 years later, after being given a single transfer of money, they find that incomes from people who have been given a one-off cash transfer are much higher, 60 to 90% higher 5 years later. They find that people do not spend this money on alcohol, they do not spend this money on drugs, they spend it on improving their lives and improving the lives of their children. it's something that people like us should be shouting from the rooftops, because it's evidence, very clear, rigorous evidence, that people spend their own money on themselves very wisely, and they invest in themselves very wisely, much better than charities can do it for them, and much better than governments can do it for them. So for me, the answer is cash, whether it's through a basic income or a negative income tax. I think that they're actually very similar. I think the differences are cosmetic, but just give people money.
So I might follow that, because there's been a couple of questions about kind of, and this is something the whole panel can answer. So why don't do left libertarians care about economics, and sort of why is it sort of hard to sort of reach into kind of left-wing communities with these sorts of questions? Because it seems like they should be attracted to a lot of these ideas, but they're kind of not. So what is it that, Avens, do you want to start?
So actually, one of the reasons that I love talking about, say, feminism or the drug war or certain issues or LGBT issues is because I can talk to my Democratic friends, my friends in the U.S. who consider themselves liberals or leftists. Most left libertarians that I know in the U.S. aren't particularly, they're fine with capitalism. Some of them are anarcho-syndicalists, some of them have particular economic views that I don't, but for the most part, I find them very helpful, those individuals who do have those views, and also those of us who are willing to talk about feminism and LGBT rights, while caring about the economic topics, is that we're able to reach those people and validate the things that they care about. They care about gay rights and gay marriage and abortion rights and these various topics. And to be able to validate them first before going into a conversation about economics, and to be able to then talk about, to bring those conversations forward about how, for example, one of the things that I see the left talk about a lot is just the labor market and the labor force. We care about the labor force and employees and unions and things like that. And I love to talk about those economic issues in a way that validates what they care about. So I talk about ending regulations on businesses so that there can be more businesses, so there can be more employers, so there can be more opportunities for employees to find jobs, and that puts the power into the employees' hands to be looking for jobs where employers are competing for them. And so I love to talk to leftists and to talk to people who maybe hold economic views that are fairly hostile to libertarianism, to be able to bring up these things that they care about and then walk them into the idea of a voluntary society, voluntary economic choices being better for everyone. So that's how I address that.
Go for it,
Thanks. Somewhere on the other side of the world, there's a conference of leftists asking each other, why don't libertarians listen to us? And how do we persuade libertarians? And I ask you to ask yourself, what do you think you have to learn from the left? I suspect the answer is not very much. I don't think I have a huge amount to learn from them, because I think they're wrong about things, and they think we're wrong about things. So I don't necessarily know that there is that much we can do. I think that the smart, progressive critique, the Krugman, Piketty, DeLong critique of wealth is worth engaging with. And that critique is that rent-seeking exists on an enormous scale in society, and wealth facilitates that. Wealth gives you access to politics, and wealth gives you influence over politics, which allows you to embed your own rent-seeking. That is the Piketty critique of wealth, and that is why Piketty thinks wealth is bad, and accumulated wealth is bad. Now, libertarians respond and say we should reduce the extent of politics. They respond and say politics does lots of good things, so government can do lots of good things, so instead we should try and reduce the extent of wealth and the influence wealth has over that. That, I think, is an interesting point. I think our response is also good and interesting, and I'm persuaded by our point, but that is something I think that's worth engaging with. And if we listen to their critique, then perhaps they will listen to our critiques as well.
I think it's also been a little bit difficult because we're not willing to take, we might see leftist ideas, for example, of kind of more equal bargaining power, or for example, an increased ability for someone to negotiate their wage, but we are willing to, or for example, the ability to reduce the importance or the relevance of fascism. We might see those as important ideals, but we can't take it to the full extreme. The issue is, a lot of people in the mainstream left now, the most important thing is the end consequence, is the ends. And so they're willing to sacrifice the means. But libertarians put an emphasis on means. One of the main defining things about us is that we have to see the humanity in others. For example, and I'd like to come back to the issue of would you punch a Nazi? And it's been a big thing for left libertarianism, because we've been staunchly in a fight against fascism in terms of no platforming, but we've been staunchly opposed to violence too. And the main reason we cannot come to that conclusion is because at the end of the day, we don't support using force against people's bodies, because everyone is still humans with their own rights and with the right to their own body. So the main thing I think which shuts us out is we're not willing to sacrifice means to ends. We see people's means as we're not willing to sacrifice people's individuality. We're willing to see people as humans themselves. So it means we're not as flexible, we're not going to go the whole way. So we're kind of halfway between the leftists and like, you're not really that dedicated. So it becomes difficult like that, I find.
So I wanted to follow up, because I guess this is sort of an issue that I find is sort of symptomatic amongst my queer friends, is you mentioned guns. Now, most of my queer mates, when I say, oh, you should have guns, they completely freak out, even for Australians. Sort of how do you, in your experience, how do you sort of discuss those sorts of topics where it's sort of libertarian ideas are just so sort of outside of their kind of experience or their sort of framework?
I'm not going to lie, like the people who say that they don't need guns, they're white gays. I'm really not joking, and that sounds really dismissive, but they're people who often haven't, now it's people who often haven't had the need to protect themselves. If you look to gay men in the 1960s, 1970s, they would get their hands on a gun in a second. But you find people who are living in cities, they're often people who aren't willing to touch a gun. If you got rural, you find gay men who are in a lot more danger. They will be much more willing to take up guns. If you talk to queer people of colour who are a lot more marginalised, they are more willing to take up guns and more willing to defend themselves. So you kind of got to look at how marginalised you are in the first place, and how much you trust the police to protect yourselves. A lot of people who are reluctant to support gun rights are people who already trust the police and already feel quite okay with the police protecting them. So you've got to look at your relationship with the police in the first place, I think, and look at where you're standing in society.
I have a follow-up to that really quickly.
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
What's been really funny since Trump became president of the United States is that my leftist friends all know me as somebody who owns guns, and suddenly everyone's going, hey, can you teach me how to shoot? So it's really funny because you have to take advantage of the moments in which someone on the left, or a Democrat, or anyone else, just whenever somebody distrusts government, it's a really great time to explain to them, it would be wonderful if you could shoot somebody who came to take your family away for being gay or being an immigrant or whatever. And so that's definitely a thing. And in the US, we actually have a group called the Pink Pistols, where it says pick on somebody your own caliber, and it's a gay rights, gun rights group that sets up meetups for LGBT folks and women to actually learn more about defending themselves with guns. So just so you know, we have some of that, especially in the US.
Excellent. Now, I have to say, there is more good questions than we have time for. So if I don't get to your question, make sure you approach the speakers afterwards. I think we've got lunch after this, or we've got something after this, like a break, so you can grab them. So John asks, this is a question for you, Sam, I think. The neoliberal skepticism of democracy is troubling. Is there a way that you can see neoliberalism connecting with the vision of democracy of Tocqueville that Munger defended earlier today?
The answer is yes. When I say suspicious of democracy, I don't mean to the benefit of some other system of government, of choosing who rules. I mean suspicious of democratic solutions to problems. Suspicious of the masses choosing a solution and that being the correct solution. I think Ilya Stoneman and Jeffrey Friedman are both very, very important to read for me that I've read on this, which is that people's ignorance of politics is absolutely shocking. Brian Kaplan overstates the case by talking about their lack of their ignorance of economics. It's way, way more fundamental than that. They don't know what the unemployment rate is. They don't know what what interest rates are. They don't even know what interest rates are, let alone what the level of the interest rates are. They don't know the basic. In the UK, there's a poster that asks people to every year to just guess or just say what percentage of the population do you think are immigrants, and what percentage of the population do you think are Muslims. The average guess is that 31% of the UK are immigrants, and the reality is that 13% of the UK are immigrants. The average guess about what percentage of the UK are Muslims is that 25% of the UK population are Muslims. The reality is that 5% of the population are Muslim. Now, if you don't know those things, then if you think that 25% of the population are Muslims, then yeah, maybe you would be a bit worried about immigration. I can understand why people are a bit nervous about things if their understanding of the basic fact that they themselves would agree they would need is so poor. So how can a system where the people are so fundamentally ignorant of the facts that they themselves would say that they would need to know, be one that produces good results. Now, it's not to say that a monarchy is better, it's not to say, I don't think any of those things are better, but it's to say that democracy is a very, very, very flawed tool, and democratic answers to problems tend to not work very well.
Okay, so we got one final question. You might have to answer. This one's directed to you, Andy. You might have to be a little bit quick in how you answer this, but make sure you answer it as you like. It's from Roderick. Andy, great presentation on marriage. Though the debate confuses me. The debate confuses me. You can get married, you just don't get a government certificate, something I don't understand why people want in the first place. Do you want equality even if it means government regulate your relationships? Can we campaign to deregulate marriage together?
I guess I'll break that question up a bit. So, can we campaign to deregulate marriage? I think we still can, because we still haven't got marriage equality, unless we get Labour government in and they do it themselves. I think we probably can push them. We can probably, if we can push it on the Libs, because the Libs can push it through. The question is whether the Greens and Labour agree to it. That's a more intellectual issue here. So we're talking about civil unions, I'm guessing.
Or why is it that the only difference really is, if you get married, you get a certificate. If you have a civil union, you don't. Like, why is that an issue?
I think it's because the idea of marriage is important in name. It's about being, for some reason, the issue when I'm talking about queer issues as well is that you're kind of dealing with a whole lot of diverse individuals. Like, everyone's got different experiences, different affinities with their childhoods. So some people have an affinity with the idea of marriage, and some people like the idea of a long, monogamous, loving relationship which has a big bridal ceremony, and which has got a historical past and got traditions, and held in the church, and they like it to be marriage in name because the marriage name has significance to them. The importance then for those people is they should be able to identify with that. They should be able to reclaim that for their own meaning. If they believe that their relationship is a marriage, then they should be able to call it marriage in name. I don't see why it shouldn't be. I don't see why we can stop them. That's the main thing.
Yeah.
Why should we stop them? Yeah.
We're not. Just do it.
Yeah, just do it. Yeah.
Deregulate bank account. Stopping you.
All right. Okay, so that's the final question. Now, we're going to lunch. If you are a VIP, you get a very special lunch. You get to hang out with Tim Wilson in the Liberty Lounge, which I think is down that way. I think if you have a green dot on your thing, you can get lunch. Lunch is provided. But if this panel has been fantastic, please give our speakers a round of applause.